Yeah, so I'm actually really excited. Ethan and I are both really excited for the last couple of weeks of this class, because we're finally getting to talk about ecosystem. An ecosystem is what makes, I think software engineering one of the most fun fields to be in, is because there's so many new things coming out all the time, and everything that we've been learning in this class so far about how React works, how we make our own components, can be combined with what everyone else in the world is doing, right, to make really, really cool things. I can talk on and on about the really, really interesting things that people have come up with, but this includes a lot of cool extensions to React. We've been using semantic UI, which is a part of the React ecosystem, or React and web ecosystem, which makes our app prettier without having to do much. We have React Native, which is a way to write mobile apps with React. In fact, most of the things you've learned so far apply directly to React Native. If you looked at React Native tutorial, I'm pretty confident that you would all be able to get somewhere and start making mobile apps just from what you've learned in this class. And the list goes on and on of the really, really cool things you can do. So we're going to do our best. We have 2 more lectures, or maybe 3 more. We have 4 more class periods until project presentations. Next lab is going to be a continuation of last lab, as it's one final kind of regular React project that we want to encourage you to see through to completion, as it's a pretty good challenge and encompasses a lot of the topics we taught in this class. And then the last 3 classes will all probably be a mix of lab and lecture, and kind of hopefully being a fun exploration of how we can just the cool parts and fun parts of the React ecosystem, learning about how we go from scratch to a new project, right? How you might turn an idea into reality and etc. So that's the next couple weeks. This is going to be the last lecture on Advanced React, and hopefully it'll be kind of fun. We're gonna go through some demos, or one demo that's going to teach a lot of miscellaneous topics that we've been skirting around, including this, that we've had some problems with the term this, and what arrow functions, why we keep using arrow functions. We'll talk about a bunch of cool stuff. But yeah, hopefully this will be fun. And then at the end, we'll leave time for you guys all to find project groups, because I know we said the deadline was tonight. We might push it to tomorrow night, but we can't keep pushing it too far. So it's really, really important that you guys find some people that you think you'd enjoy working with, and start thinking about what you want to do for your final project. So, and we'll talk more about that at the end of class. But cool. Any questions before we start? Awesome. So today's agenda, really the reason that we bring a lot of these up, it might seem that we're just kind of throwing a hodgepodge of random syntactical stuff. We've always done JS or React tidbits, but these are, while they are in some sense tidbits, they're really, really important, because you will undoubtedly run into almost all of these while you're working on React, or you've already run into a lot of these bugs, and now we're finally we're pretty comfortable talking about them. And that's why this stuff is important. But yeah, we're going to be talking about some syntactical things, some final kind of 1 or 2 liners that are really useful. More about why we use key, right? We've run into this. You probably run into this issue of you need to specify a key prop. We'll talk about why, and we'll show what happens if we don't do that correctly, which most people in fact don't use key correctly. We'll talk about the children prop, and then we'll also talk about this problem of this. What does it mean to bind something? I know it was in our last lab, but I think it's worth a lecture. Yeah, cool. So this is our agenda today. Great. The first thing we're going to talk about, quick tidbit, is props spreading. So usually, let's look at this last line real quick. When we want to pass in props to a component, we do so like this. School, this is the name of the component. This is our first prop, the school name, UC Berkeley. Our second prop is year 1868, right? Sometimes you might find yourself having an object that you're basically entering one by one all the keys of the object in as props into a component. And in fact, as you work with bigger React projects, a lot of data is stored in JavaScript objects, and it would be really convenient if we can just pass in the object's keys as a prop. And that's exactly what prop spreading does. Is that, let's say we have this object called school info, right? And it has the name of the school as well as the year, right? We can pass, we can write with this syntax where we once again say the name of the component and then add these brackets, ... school info, right? It's going to pass in each of the keys of the object in as values to, or in as props to the component, the school component. So this is a really, really slick way of kind of passing objects in as props, but it'll actually, these 2 lines are equivalent in the sense that each of these keys will get passed in as separate props. So this is a really convenient way to kind of write props, and if you see this syntax, it might be very confusing at first because you're wait, hold on, that's not how I've seen props done in the past, but this is something called props spreading. there's a lot of really cool, like we talked about spreading in the past of being able to like take variables out of an object. Spreading has like a lot of really, really cool and useful like use cases in JavaScript all over. So any questions about this? Cool. I think, this kind of begs the question for me, like what if the key's name is like, is not a one word thing? Like what if it's a string? Ethan, I'm actually gonna ask this question. If the object is like, if the key of the object is not school, but like school space name, right? Like, does the prop get passed in? Okay, so I guess the prop will then have it'll get directly passed into the object, and you access it by doing this.props and then the brackets of the actual full string. So every single one of the keys of the object get passed in directly as props. So you have to be kind of careful in case you pass in some props that you didn't mean to pass in. But yeah. What questions do you have about prop spreading? By the way, you can actually, you can add props, you can combine these two things. So you can have 3 regular props as well as props spread from another object. You can combine these two interchangeably. Cool, let's move on. Conditional rendering. So we've definitely run into this in the past, but we've never really confronted it head on, and we wanted to talk about it real quick. So sometimes you might find yourself that based on a variable, you want to render a component or not render the component, right? Or maybe render 2 different versions of the component. So you may or may not have seen this syntax in your other CS classes, but we call this a ternary operator, where let's break this down. We're only looking at the first line right now. So this is the whole statement right here. This first part is going to be a Boolean value. This is going to be whether, if this is true or false, that's what this statement's going to be checking. If it's true, it's going to kind of evaluate to the first thing in the next line. If it's false, it's going to evaluate to what comes after the colon. So it's usually A question mark B colon C. And I guess we can actually just see this, where we have, I'll make this bigger, we have, let's say 2 plus 2 equals 4, question mark, if this thing is true, then we'll evaluate to hello, otherwise we'll evaluate to world. What am I missing here? Oh, whoops. Great. So this evaluates to hello because the statement was true. If we instead replace this with something that's false, we get world, right? So this is a pretty simple, one line kind of if-then statement, which you'll see often in computer science just because it's very convenient to write. And we can actually use this in React with JSX the same way we can with regular operators. And so we see that inside this div, we're saying if this.props.name, which is equivalent to asking, does this prop exist, right? Is it empty or is it does it have a value? We're saying if it has a value, display this value between 2 paragraph tags. If not, display null, which is equivalent of displaying nothing. So this is a very common practice. Another way you might see this, which is we're not going to get too deep into the why this works, but this.props.name and 2 ampersands plus the component you want to render if it's true. And so this is kind of getting rid of the else case in some sense. Cool. What questions do you guys have about conditional rendering? You can also do this in if statements, and you can do all sorts of different ways of writing this code, but you'll very often need to conditionally render a component, and this is a really slick way of doing it. Yeah.
The and if it's the same as in shell syntax, do you have the or to render in case it's false?
That's a good question. So wait, if it's false, I'm not quite sure if it would do that, but I believe the simpler way would just put a not statement in front of this. Yeah, that would be the more React way, is that you'll see and it used a lot more than anything else. Yeah, good question though, and worth trying out. I'm not super familiar with exactly all the different operators that React supports, but cool. Any final questions? This is all we have, I think, for the tidbits. Great. So we're gonna see in this demo 3 different things that we want to come away with. What is the it's kind of hard to name this problem. I call it this problem, but we can what is the problem with this anyway? Why do we run into this so much in React, and what is the solution? We're also going to be talking about the key prop, why this is really important, and how to use it properly. And we'll talk about the children prop, and yeah, how that's used. So you'll see these 3 things, and then we'll have some slides reviewing, and that'll be it for this lecture. Great. All right, so real quick, what we're trying to build here is a list of books with notes shuffled to each of them. So we have 5 books here. We have Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the 3 first Harry Potter books, a book by Ethan Lee, Why I Love JavaScript, and then Cracking the Coding Interview, some classics here. And our goal is that we can press shuffle to randomly shuffle these books around. Well, I know this is kind of contrived, this isn't really like why, but like, you might find that you need to shuffle things around at some point or change the order of the way things appear. And then finally, if I write down a note like, what a great book, if I press shuffle, it should follow it around. Right? Those are the kind of three or four things that we want to see in this app. So this is what we're trying to build at the end of the day. So let's go to the starter code. This time we'll hopefully have less technical difficulties than last time. Oh man, why is this so... Okay, I'm going to try to make it so we can see more of the code. So right now nothing appears on the screen. Let me uncomment this react.render. So the one component we're rendering so far is the shuffling book list. Right? This is our main component. We're going to put all of our logic. And right now it just displays hello. And that's because the render function just returns hello. Right? So let's see where to start with this. At the top of our component, we have this object or list of books. And each book is an object with a title and an author, except the last one that doesn't have an author. So we'll try to handle that case later too. All right. So yep, that's our goal. Let's try to get this working. So as we can see, the last thing we have already is in our constructor, we're setting up our initial state with all the books in that big array. Right? So our initial state, right when we start the component, is that huge array. And now our job is, our first task is going to be to try to display this array. So where do I start with displaying this array of books? Oh wait, sorry, one last thing. Is that I already have a book component that has no state. In fact, it could have been a function instead. It's just a render function. This HTML is kind of ugly, but this is what we might call a dumb component. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't know anything about any fancy state stuff. All it does is display a book. It takes in a book object as a prop, pulls out the title and author, and displays it in a pretty common way. And we have this.props.children thing, which we'll return to. But yeah, so we have that, and I want to render a book component for every book in the array. How might I go about this? Anyone have any ideas? Yeah?
Use the map function.
Exactly, we can use the map function. So where would we let's just start. In this return, let's make this div bigger. And then inside here, we will do this.state.books, right? So because we're just accessing whatever's in our current state. We don't want to use the outermost books because we want to make sure that as we change state to change the order of the books, we properly get the order updates as well. So we have to make sure we use state. This.states.books.map. Let me just get this in front of me. Map. And then we want to pass into map a function that takes in the book. And in the book, we just render the book component. And this is pretty simple, thankfully. If that works. What am I missing here?
Either need to say return or change the curly brackets.
Good call. Yeah. So what's going on here, the reason why this doesn't work is that because right now what I'm doing is I'm saying, I'm creating a Lambda function. And we talked earlier about the many different ways to kind of create a short Lambda function. But if we're just going to do this, I need to either prefix this with return, or I need to make these parentheses so that JavaScript knows that what I'm trying to do is just return the first, the one thing I'm passing in. So this will also work. Do I need one more parentheses? Awesome. So what we have here is all of our books showing up. Awesome, right? Any questions so far? This should hopefully be kind of a review of what we've already done a couple times, right? All right, great. Next step is I want to create a button at the top of my screen that shuffles the books around. So this is also hopefully relatively straightforward. We've seen this at least a couple times where we have a button. So I'm not going to say shuffle. And in this onChange, I want to call a function, right? I want to do something to the books array that's currently in state to shuffle it around, right? So for this, I'm going to create a shuffle function. Create a shuffle function, and this will be pretty straightforward. I already imported a function called shuffle that'll do the work for me. Otherwise, you might have to look into exactly what your use case is, et cetera, et cetera. But this will be pretty straightforward so far. Is that we have set state, and we're going to pass in a new book array and shuffle around this.state.books. So what this is doing is it's taking the current this.state.books, shuffling it, and setting it to a new setting state to have this new value of the books array. right? And shuffle does not change the existing array. It returns a brand new shuffled array. So that's how that works. What am I missing?
How do you determine which shuffle is which shuffle? So why are both functions?
Oh, that's a good point. This would be referred to as this dot shuffle whenever you needed to use it, but that is a fair point. Let's just call this shuffle books for clarity. The specific naming convention is details of the JavaScript language, but this shuffle is coming from, I defined it by importing it here. So that's where that's defined. And it wouldn't cause a naming conflict because the shuffle our shuffle function here, if we had called it shuffle, we would access it by using this dot shuffle. So they don't really clash. Yeah. But that's a good point that you have to be kind of careful of. You should name your functions. You should name your functions carefully to make sure that it's not your code isn't confusing. Because someone who might not notice that would think that would be a recursive function or might get a little confused. Anyway, shuffle books. Any questions on how shuffle books works? Yeah, relatively straightforward again. And now on change, I want to say, what function should you call? You should call shuffle books, right? Fantastic. So this code work? Everything look pretty good to me? Anyone have any thoughts of things we're missing? I think it's reasonable to think it would work. Let's try it out. I'm going to try it on its own browser, just so we can get all the errors. If I press shuffle, nothing actually ends up happening, right? And this brings us to this problem, right? I'm going to open up the console and see what's going on. We have this issue, which is another thing we have to talk about. Each child in the list should have a unique key prompt. Oh, crap. Yeah, you're right. On click. Thank you. Click. So make sure we refresh this page. The key error will come up immediately, but the moment I press shuffle, I get another error that says, besides that one, cannot read property set state of undefined. Right? This is something you'll run into very often. And when you're developing in React, many of you have probably already ran into it, gotten very confused, Googled it, gotten a weird answer, and decided to copy it and not worry about it, just like I did when I was first learning React. But let's talk about what's going on here. We will not be able to get into why this error really is happening, but we can at least talk about the problem and how to solve it. So let's ignore this one for now. Let's focus on this. Cannot read property set state of undefined. So one thing we might try to do, right, is what do you mean we can't call it as undefined? Let's look at our code. We called set state on this, right? Why isn't this what we expect it to be? Let's look into our actual source code, and it might be difficult for me to do this because there's so many, or it's a very big screen, but I'll try my best. So actually, I'm gonna give this a shot. If it doesn't work, then let me refresh the page. Right now, all I changed was I wanted it to pause on exceptions, so that when it runs into an error, it's going to pause the program and let me examine what exactly is going on and what all the variables evaluate to. So if I press shuffle, it'll pause, and this is where the error happened, right? And I can hover over this and see that this is actually undefined, right? And that's where our problem lies, is that for some reason, sometimes when we pass functions around in React, right, this no longer means what we wanted it to mean, right? When we were writing this code, we expected this to be the current component or the instance of the shuffling book list component that we were working on, right? But somehow in the process, it became undefined, right? And where did this happen? I can try to give a somewhat, close that up. I will give a somewhat shallow explanation of why this happens, but I won't really be able to get into it fully. And if you're interested in why, I recommend you start looking into JavaScript's how JavaScript handles scoping. But effectively is when we pass in this.shuffleBooks to the on-click a button, right? When we actually press this button, this is no longer what we want it to be. Whenever you pass in a function to a component, what this represents gets a little bit funky, and eventually, in this case, as we can see, it ends up being undefined, right? And this is an issue, right? When we write this function, we expect that this will refer to our shuffling book list component, right? So we can access its state, we can call its function called setState, right? We somehow want to make sure that this is what we want it to mean, right? So the problem, the key thing to acknowledge here is the problem is that this is undefined, right? It's not what we expected it to be. And our question is, how do we solve this problem? How do we make sure that when we write this function, we can safely assume that this is what we wanted it to be, right? Does anyone have any, like, what questions you guys have on, like, what I just said, like, what the problem is? Does everyone see, like, what's going wrong? It's a little bit of a confusing question to ask, but, like, the key thing is that we're passing in this function, right, into another component, but when this other component has this function and calls it, this is not, like, what we originally meant it to be, right? Yeah?
Does it like lose the reference to the original like shuffling Brooklyn's component?
Yeah. In some way, like it's hard to explain like exactly like losing a reference to like. Even I don't know too much of the details, but you could think of it like that, as in like when you pass this thing around, this no longer like refers to shuffling book list component. Yeah.
So is it like the on-click button passes in like this dot shuffle books, which is refers to this object, but then when it goes on-click, this might refer to the button, and then they're like, oh, I don't know what's happening.
Yeah, I can see how like where that logic, like frame of logic comes from, and you can like that's actually how I first started understanding it. But as we could see in the inspector, it's not that this refers to the button. This is just undefined, right? It's not set to anything, right? You can definitely like I encourage like using that as a stepping point to thinking that like this might refer to like something inside the button, right? We don't really know what happened to this, right? But ultimately like we can see from the code that it's not just the button; it's completely undefined, which is really problematic. But anyway, so the real question is how do we solve this problem? There's two different ways and two very common ways to solve this problem. The first is arrow functions. So strangely enough, if I were to surround this with this.shuffle books and then just make this a function call, which seems very pointless. We've been doing this all class, but if you actually think of what's going on here, this feels kind of dumb because we're just creating another lambda function that does one thing and calls the original function we wanted to make, right? And that seems to be useless. However, when we create inside these anonymous arrow functions, the definition of this is actually preserved. It is what we intended it to be. And now if we do this, it works, right? So this is a common way of solving this problem. In case you're not a fan of making your render function full of these arrow functions that seem kind of dumb, we can actually solve this problem in a different way of making this, instead of a regular function, we can make this an arrow function, right? So now shuffle books itself is just a variable set to an anonymous arrow function, right? This will also solve our problem. And this is something that you might see is that just like, easy way to solve the problem, make sure all your functions are just always arrow functions. Never write a regular function, right? Except for maybe your lifecycle functions. But yeah, any function you use this in and want to use get values out of it, you need to wrap it in an arrow function. But one might also say, this is actually not the best way to do it too. This is not the best practice. I think this is a pretty safe practice. But another way you will very often see it is in the constructor when you want to use this instead of a function. Another way to do it is saying this.shufflebooks is equal to this.shufflebooks.bind this. This, I can't begin to explain to you what this does. However, effectively the practical use cases is this also makes sure that in the shuffle books function, this refers to what you want it to. It preserves the meaning of this. And once again, shuffle works. There are many ways. There are two main ways: is that it's either binding or you make everything an arrow function. So this is why we've always been using arrow functions in this course. We've been avoiding this because it's a lot to talk about. But here's your answer. Here's how to solve this problem, and you will 100% run into it again. Questions? Yeah. Sorry I couldn't. Sorry that's difficult to explain. Why that's the answer. That might be a little unsatisfying. Feel free. We strongly encourage you to look it up. Anyway, awesome. Right? We have our app right here, and it's working. Let me open this up in a new tab. This is our finished version, but let's open up our temporary version. Great. So now to solve. Why isn't it? Oh, I didn't save index.js. What? Cool. Right? Nice. All right. So the next issue that we're going to talk about is the children prop, right? So we define this book component as a dumb component. We don't want it to deal with state at all, right? We want it to be just what we call what you might hear as a presentational component. All it does is takes in props and displays something. It doesn't really worry about anything fancier than that. So sometimes, however, we might want to customize, add some behavior to our book component, right? But we don't we're kind of like struggling between two things of us wanting to add behavior to the component, right? Perhaps adding like an input box where you can take notes, or maybe a button where you can delete it from the list, right? But because like maybe we're working in a bigger context, like we're working at a company that this book component, we can't really change it too much, right? We're not allowed to make it have state. Like that's just a rule that we've been forced to deal with, right? How do we get around this? Well, we have this prop that we mentioned at the very beginning when we talked about React called children, right? And I think the easiest way to talk about like what's going or how this works is to let's say I want to add this input box that I had earlier, right? This that we saw in our final solution. It doesn't do anything. We're not going to really go into the whole state thing. Of course, you could do that. You could have state for each one of these things and like assign some value to onChange. For now, we're literally just going to have an input box that doesn't do anything. It's just going to exist, right? Let's say that we have this book component that's kind of dumb, right? But we want this input box to show up with every single book, right? And for now, and like so what we're seeing here is that we have a component where we don't like we're not just like ending it in one line, right? Where we actually have like an opening tag and a closing tag, right? And what happens when you have an opening tag and a closing tag with a component is that everything inside gets passed in as a prop. It actually does, like everything inside doesn't automatically get displayed. It's just like syntactical sugar for passing everything inside as a prop, right? And so where we see that is right here, right? This.props.children, right? So I said after I display the title and the author, I want to pass in, after I display the title and the author, display whatever this.props.children is, right? So this is kind of saying like, I don't know what my parent asked me to display, right? But whatever it is, display it here, right? Like whatever they wanted, just like put it in here. Why isn't this working? Did I break it? Okay, cool, it's working again. Right, if I didn't have, sad. If I didn't have this, like it wouldn't show up, right? Because even though even though it looks like it's going to appear on the page, it's actually getting passed in as a prop. And if you want it to show up, you have to decide to render it. You have to say this.props.children. But this children prop is really important because as like, it's hard to find a truly, or like this is actually probably the most like one of the big use cases is sometimes our components like will have like additional behavior, right? We have this book component, and as far as the book component knows, its job is to render a title and an author, right? Nothing else. But because its parent might want to add more functionality, it says, all right, render the title, render the author, and render whatever else, like, you know, the parent put inside my two like tags. Questions on what's going on here, right? So here, I'm passing in an input tag, right, in between these book components. This input tag gets wrapped up in a prop called children, passed down to the book component, and the book component decides to render it. Yeah.
If you have like multiple, so like you have like an input tag and you have like other things that like follow it, would that also get passed down as like props, like the children props?
Yep. This whole thing, everything in between these tags gets wrapped up into one variable, right? And this is JSX. That's totally valid, and it'll get sent down as a prop.
How do you like access it besides like children? You can't access the children individually, or you have to access it as like an entire roster?
Yeah, that's a good point. There are like more. Yeah, that's the case. Like you have to access it as a whole block. You don't really get to interfere with what your parent passed in. But yeah, you just take whatever your parent passed in and kind of inject it into the page wherever you deem necessary. But there are as far as we've learned so far, but there are like more different ways to be able to like dive into a little bit beyond the scope. What you're asking is possible, but like from the basics that we're going to cover today, like not really.
Children is like an array, almost. Close.
Okay, cool. Children is like an array. Which, yeah, okay. Good question. Other questions? Awesome. So, seems like we got a pretty working thing so far. Let's see, what if I type in, I don't know if this will work. Hello? Right? Ooh, yikes. Right? Why is it that when I type in hello or like, you know, this is a great book, right, and shuffle this around, this input box, like the words we typed in, actually stay at the top. It doesn't get shuffled around with the book, right? This is our final like key problem that we need to talk about, right? And why exactly this is happening might get a little bit fuzzy. It's a little bit difficult to explain. But when we map over a list, right, like what React tries to do when it needs to re-render the page, right? When we send it a new array of books, right, We called this.setState. We created a new array of books, and we sent it in to this.setState. And React's going to try to figure out what parts of the DOM, what parts of like the components that we asked it to render, does it actually need to re-render. And one of the issues of having like a list of objects is that it's kind of difficult for React to identify which objects actually changed, right? If we don't really give it a way of like acknowledging each object, as in like, if we don't give a unique identifier to each thing in the list, then React isn't entirely sure what to do. This is a little bit like, again, like the true reasons behind there's a great article on it in the React docs, but let's take a common solution and something you probably also found on the internet to this problem. So we look at the error that happens here, right? It says that each child in the list should have a unique key prop. Something that is extremely common in React code is taking the index of the, that's the wrong way. Taking the index of the element and using that as the key. It asks for a unique key, and this is a unique key, right? But if we try this still won't solve our problem. And the reason is because we're using the index of like the book in the array. And basically what's happening here is that React is looking at this first book element that we've rendered, right? And it's seeing that, okay, well this first book element was the same, like had the key like 0 both this time and after the re-render, right? So I'm actually going to preserve like certain parts of this element. Like I don't need to change everything because React thinks that it's the same component in some sense, right? It thinks that like it acknowledges this first book component that we're rendering as like, it acknowledges this first book component that we're rendering as the same component as it was before we shuffled them around. Because it's using, we told it to use I, or the index of that element, as the unique key to identify this element, right? What questions do you guys have there? That was a little strange, but the reason, I'm going to repeat that again. The reason that like, our input box like, is staying with the same text is that because React thinks, in some sense, that because the key was 0 both times, it was still the first element on the page, that it's the same element with like slightly different props. So it's going to kind of preserve the state or like certain parts of that element. Yeah?
So do you solve it by not taking I from the map function, but from some state?
Yeah, the key thing, or like the way to fix this is that it didn't ask like just for a unique thing. It needs to be uniquely identifying. It should be something that identifies like this component, like that explicitly different from all other components, right? So sometimes you might have like every book might have like a ISBN number, right? And we can be absolutely sure that this ISBN number is a unique identifier for this book, and that would be a good key prop. In this case, we could use book.title, right? Book.title is unique to each book, and it identifies each book beyond its order in the array. And that's the key thing is very often people use, and you'll see, I guarantee you'll see index being used as like the key for something in a map, but that's bad practice because if you have this problem of like shuffling like elements around, you're going to run into this issue of like the state, like React getting confused because you're not using the key prop correctly. Key prop should always be 1, unique, and 2, identifying the object like or the specific component you're putting in. Right. Yeah.
So we use the title and now it's uniquely identified to each of them. Does the shuffle thing work out?
Hello. Let's see. Yep. Right. So like this is actually it. So, all right, let me make that bigger. Let me refresh this. Let's say I'm like, okay, cool. First book, second book, third book, fourth book. Sorry, I don't know why that's going to bother me now. Third, and I guess fifth book. No. Fifth book. Right. Now if I press shuffle around, the things follow it. Right? It actually does preserve because now it knows which element, which component is each component. And React can do what it does best and then like intelligently figure out what parts of each component it needs to re-render. Yeah. So this is a really, again, like important part of like React is whenever you like loop over a list and like show things, you should always pass in a key prop that uniquely identifies it. If you don't have a unique identifier, then index might be your best bet. But you have to be really careful because if you use index, you're also kind of like assuming that the array that you're passing in will never change order. If it never changes order, then you're probably okay by using index. But if your array ever might change order, then you might run into some issues, as we can see here. Our array kept changing order, and because we were using index as a prop, or as the key prop, React kind of assumed that every time the first element was there, it was the same element as it was before. Cool. All right, last thing we're going to do. This is a little awkward. Cracking the coding interview doesn't have an author, right? But we're still displaying author : this, right? Let's use the final thing we learned, which was conditional rendering to fix this problem, right? So here we have us displaying author, right? And all I'm going to do is say, basically, author and. So I pulled out author of the this.props.book, and I'm saying if author exists, then display. I need to wrap this in a div so that like it's just one JSX component, but oh yeah, thanks. But here is this conditional renderer of saying that if author actually has a value, right, then display this div. Otherwise, don't display this div, right? And as we can see here, hopefully now. Whoa. Oh, I accidentally pressed Command S. Oh, need to press save. So now cracking the code editor doesn't have an author, right? Another alternative way to do this that might be like a little bit better is saying that author ? And if author does exist, display that. If it doesn't exist, display like no author found. Right, and this might be another way of, let me get rid of these. Cool. And now if we go back to, cool. Right, so here it says no author found. Right, so this is another just random use case of conditional render. Great, there's all our tidbits for the day, as well as an example for all of them. Questions? Yeah?
This is maybe unrelated, but is it possible to do if statements in the brackets?
Is it possible to do if statements in the brackets?
Like not like one-liner if can you do this multiple lines, but like an actual if and then like a whole bunch of stuff.
I don't think so, because everything in those like kind of like brackets are meant to be evaluated as a single expression, right? So that would be the kind of problem. If you wanted to do like more than one line if statements, which is very common, you would do so above like out here. You might say like let author text and then like if author, like author text is equal to like div and so on, right? You might do it out there and then just inside here put author text. Yeah, but good question. All right, great. I want to make sure we have time to look for look at project groups. So I'm going to move on. But again, what is this? These are the three different ways you might solve this problem, right? You might make it an error function in the prop. You might put it in the bind it to the constructor, or in the function definition, just define it as an error function, right? Three solutions. The key prop, you should always make sure that like it's a unique thing for each item. Ideally, every item comes with an ID, but if it doesn't, you need to find something that's unique. Worst case, use the index. And this helps React know what elements it needs to like keep, like where does the state go, basically. And finally, the children prop, like everything in between here gets passed in as a prop called children, which, as Ethan corrected, it's kind of like an array that gets passed in as a prop, and then some component can, access it and display it. Yeah. And one kind of like good method to know what you're allowed to put inside those like curly braces is if you can't console.log it, you can't like put it in those curly braces, right? So if you're allowed, if you think you can, if you can like imagine console.logging like some value, then you're allowed to put it in curly braces. Otherwise, it's not going to work, right? So that's kind of like good rule of thumb. So if statements, you can't put a complicated if statement in there, but you can put a single line ternary expression. Yeah. Awesome. So let's we didn't really get a chance to talk about the project, but the project has 4 or 5 different prompts you may choose as like kind of starting points. So maybe let's if I pull up the project here, let me pull it up real quick. You guys need to find groups by tomorrow. So the 4 prompts we have are like a task management system of some kind, so like Trello or Asana, a Reddit client or like a Hacker News client or any kind of like news client where you can post, search, and filter things. A Pinterest client where it's much more about displaying images and also maybe posting images, we'll see. A Spotify client, a fun way of visualizing like your Spotify like playlist using the Spotify API, which is an added challenge. And then finally, you can decide to design your own and so on. There are requirements here You can read through them at your own time. They're relatively straightforward. We also have some ambition features that we'll work on improving over time. But we'll hopefully talk a little bit more about this next week, the details of the requirements. Right now, let's maybe split the room into a couple corners of like task management system back there, Reddit client up here, Pinterest client over here, Spotify client over there, make your own somewhere in the middle. And then like, if you have an idea of what you might want to do, or you're like, just like stroll around it a little bit, your goal is to find project groups of around 2 to 4 people. You guys can figure out in your own time what you want to work on later. You're not bound to anything. But you need to fill out the form for like your project team registration by tomorrow night. We will all email you excessively if you don't fill it out by that time. And then heads up, by next week, we'll be doing like project check-ins where you have to take a proposal to a TA. And the proposal, we'll update the due date. The proposal has to be done the night before your check-in with the TA. So we'll release signups, but keep in mind that once you make your project team, you need to start thinking immediately about like what exactly you want to do. And we'll release those guidelines on what you have to submit, everything, and the signups, etc. Cool. Sounds good? Task management, Reddit, Pinterest, Spotify, create your own somewhere in the middle. Go. I will open attendance and you can do attendance after class.